Hi, everybody. I wanted to start with just a little short off topic to follow on what Murray said when he appreciated the work that Christy and his amazing DOOR team have done. And I wanted to point out that, yes, the organization is super, and we as speakers feel really well taken care of, but there's another thing that they're doing. The thing that's really struck me about this conference is that they've designed it as a story that they're telling us through the various speakers and the exercises that they're guiding us through. And there's been various themes that have been flowing through the presentations that you've seen. And I realized that they were designing this story when the themes started repeating, and I realized, oh, I'm going to talk about that too. Shit. Oh, I was going to talk about that. But then I realized it's okay, because everybody is mentioning it in a different context, and by showing their personal take, they are deepening these themes. So mine is rewriting the news and learning to notice what we don't see. And I'm going to start with a short little exercise, something I want to invite you to do. Take a look. Take a look and see if you can pick out a few details from the painting. This is Hieronymus Bosch, his famous triptych, The Garden of Earthly Delights. I thought you might like this one. He has some that are scarier, but this one's fun to look at. So take a look and allow your gaze to take hold of the details that appeal to you. Find parts of this painting that have a particular appeal, and study the details, please. Juicy, huh? So now turn to the person sitting next to you and tell them what detail you chose. Yeah, there were a lot of details. Okay, stop. Come back. How many of you had the same detail as your partner? Some? I would say that's about 10% of the room. And there's a reason why most of us didn't have the same detail that they focused on. And the reason is it was explained by a guy named George Miller, I believe. Is that right? Let me check my notes. Yes, George Miller from Princeton. He wrote a study called The Magic Number 7 ± 2, Some Limits on Our Capacity of Processing Information. This was 1956. And the guy counted how many objects our working memory can hold at a given time. And the answer is 7 ± 2, which means 5 to 9. Now, this seems probable. Most of us can think about having memorized phone numbers. You remember when we used to do that? Right? And we were able to memorize 9-digit numbers. So that's 9. We were able to memorize addresses, names. It's probable, 7 ± 2. But do you know how many bits of information are out there at any given moment? I'm going to tell you because the number is really impressive. It's 11 million. I mean, if there was a lot of details here, but your body, your senses, yeah, that's distracting for you, I see that. Let me hide that again. But aside from the picture, your body's senses are processing information about the smells in this room, the textures of the clothing you're wearing, the temperature, the sounds, the other details of the lights, my hair, the person sitting next to you. There's about 11 million bits of information that we are ingesting unconsciously all the time. And only 7 plus minus 2 bits of information make it to the conscious mind. What that means is that there's an incredible amount of compression happening. Compression and selection. Studies have been done to actually count how much information we are now being subjected to because human beings have started creating information very intensely over the last 60 years. And it turns out that despite our body's limited capacity to ingest information, the amount that we are exposed to has grown. I have 2 studies I can tell you. One is that we are exposed to about the sum of 174 newspapers a day. That's an approximation of how much information we're exposed to. Now, compared to our grandparents, the amount of information they were exposed to during their entire life, we get now in a month. So, and from that, we are able to pick out our 11 million, and then filter out from that our 7 plus minus 2, which means we're really no longer anyone, no neurologist believes anymore that human beings as individuals have any kind of contact with objective reality. Like basically, there is too much of it, and everybody is picking out different bits. This is what our brain does for us. Thanks to this process, we don't overheat and our heads don't explode every day when we're trying to understand and go through the motions of our daily life. So this is basically our brain filtering for us, because it would not be beneficial to try to comprehend all the information around us. And there are 2 ways that the brain does this amazing selection process. One of them is our attention. So the things we pay attention to are the things we see. The things we don't pay attention to, they disappear. Take your nose, for example. Can you see it? Like now when you think about it, you can kind of see it, right? You're looking forward and oh my God, there it is. It's been there all along. But every day, we're not seeing our nose. I don't register my glasses or the bit of hair or my nose because I have a limited capacity to digest all this information. So my brain makes selections for me, either via attention or via automatic processes. And these automatic processes have a name that has very negative connotations these days. They're called biases, right? Biases help our brain determine what we notice and what we don't notice. I want to talk about biases for just a little bit. There are 183 biases that we all have, types of biases that cognitive psychologists have defined. There's the decision-making, belief, and behavioral biases. That's the biggest group. Social biases, and then memory errors. So the way we remember things, the things we have a tendency to remember. And I'm going to go through a few of these just to see if you recognize them. There's the curse of knowledge, when better informed people find it extremely difficult to understand the people who are not as well informed. I feel like Andy and Ellie challenged us to do that yesterday when they presented us with perspectives for people who underwent a completely different cultural process than we have. Another bias is normalcy bias, which is the refusal to plan for or to even acknowledge that something bad is going to happen because it's never happened before, right? And I was thinking about this bias yesterday when we were watching Emila's movie, when her mother was saying, you never really know when a war is going to start. You never really believe that war is going to happen because it's never happened in your lifetime before. And this is why. This one's fun. It turns out IKEA has its own special bias. I don't think they knew that when they created a commercial concept where you put together your own furniture, but that's part of why we love IKEA. It's not just that this stuff is cheap and it looks pretty good, it's also because we get to put it together. And that works with food as well. Like things we make ourselves tastes good to me. Can't understand why the kids don't want to eat it. But that's how it works. And I believe that a number of these biases have a huge influence on the way newspapers work. And let me read my notes to make sure I don't miss anything I really want to tell you. Oh, right. Aside from these 183 identified, defined, named biases, there's also, every one of us has personal biases. These are the things that we get from our family. Andy was talking about prejudice that he'd grown up with, that he had to reevaluate, right? Most of us are taught, our brains are taught by things that were hard, by things that went really well, by things that we saw over and over again. These can be traumas, successes, or everyday reality. Repetition makes reality, right? Things that happen all the time, we tend to think it's true, and it will always be true. So we also, on top of these 183 filters, we've got our own personal ones that determine what bits of the big picture we're coming away with. Now imagine how this affects the news. We rely on newspapers to tell us what's happening in the world, right? Newspapers narrate current affairs. They tell the story of modern history to us. And yet, they also are subject to bias. And I want to look at some of those because I think you might recognize them or find them interesting. One of them is negativity bias. This is one of my favorites. It's a really, really powerful way that our brain has of making us react more strongly to things that are negative than things that are positive. And in fact, this has been calculated. We will react 3 times more strongly to something bad than to something good. 3 times. And if it's in a relationship, it's 5 times as bad. Like those socks in the middle of the floor, or you need 5 positive things to balance out your opinion about your partner rather than the 3 that you need if it's just bad news. So intuitively, newspapers and newspaper editors, they know this, they recognize this, and they have a very visible tendency of putting bad news on the front page. There's even a term that was coined to describe this in 1989 in New York. If it bleeds, it leads, they say. There's another bias that I see playing out in tabloids a lot. And it's a memory bias, which means that if things are bizarre, if they're weird, we're more likely to remember them. So you see things like this. Thank you to BuzzFeed. I found this on BuzzFeed. I'll give you one more. I'm sorry, I'll read them for the people who can't see. So it's a best man left bleeding after being hit in head by flying dildo. I never thought I'd say that in front of an audience. And then another one, deer with rabies kicks a La Vale woman in the face. Now this is from tabloid papers, but news portals are particularly gifted with finding weird things to spread around the internet. And the reason they do that is because we have an innate preference for reading weird things, and we tend to remember them, and then we go back to see our friends in the evening, and we're like, did you hear about the flying dildo? You know, and that happens much more often than the details of a war far away. right? Or good news about our economy and unemployment going up X%. So we tend to remember these things. And there's a particular bias that pisses me off in the news industry. It's called in-group bias. It's a social bias. And it's the tendency for people to give preferential treatment to others they perceive to be members of their own groups. This doesn't just happen in newspapers, of course. It happens everywhere, where we are more likely to trust and think well of people who are like us. This is normal, and it's normal for our brain to do this. It is an evolutionary tool that helped us survive because it was easier to trust members of our own tribe and of our own species. However, now that we are no longer in caves and civilization has progressed so that we know better, we still have a tendency to prefer people who are similar to us. And I know all this, so I thought I was immune until I was going through a recruitation process for a project that I did before NewsMavens. And I was doing it with my team. We had a big pile of resumes, and we were looking through them, putting stars by the names of people we thought we'd want to meet in person. And I found this great CV, this woman, she just really, I had a good feeling about her, you know? So I put a star and a little heart. And I passed it to my editor and said, take a look at this one. I think she's a winner. And Anya burst out laughing. She says, Sue, she looks just like you. And it was true. Same haircut, same glasses. Shit. So this happens to the best of us. But we really have to watch it, because the consequences of having something as important as our newspapers in the hands of one particular social group are really dire. Now, I discovered this statistic thanks to the incredible work of the International Women in Media Foundation. And they went around the world and they counted. They counted how many women were in charge of newspapers. Now, this is an important distinction between in charge and working on the staff. And it's important because there are a lot of excellent women journalists. In fact, I would say that we are practically at parity, and there's an equal number of women and men journalists working in the field. However, the editor-in-chief, or the editor of the newsroom, the person who controls the newsroom, as Jennifer was saying in her excellent presentation, is an authoritarian figure. No matter how many excellent women you have on your team, it's this usually guy who says, nah, I don't want you to write that story. Or fine, write it, but I'll put it in the back. It's this guy who decides what gets promoted, what's on the front page, what stories do we follow up, what are the most important stories of our day. And this is not to say that the stories that men find relevant and interesting are not so. I don't think that. But I think that because of the natural biases that we are all equipped with, men are conditioned to notice slightly different things than women are. Even in 2018, we raise our girls differently. There was this amazing study about how moms talk to their kids when there's a child crying in the playground. And a little boy asks, Mom, why is that kid crying? And if it's a little boy, then he gets a really short explanation. Oh, he fell, let's go. If it's a little girl, she fell because she didn't listen to her mother. And she gets this significantly longer and more involved explanation of the intricate, complex social situation that has made this person cry. Now, what does that mean? That means that women are more often taught to notice social issues than men. And this is just one of the many examples, and I'm sure in all of the many places that you come from, this plays out a little differently. But boys and girls tend to be taught to notice different things. And when we notice different things, then we look for them in the future. They become automatically the things we notice. And all the rest of the things, like our nose, disappears. So I think this is an issue, that there are 27% of women running newsrooms only. But there's only two ways that you can work with bias. One is bias training. Facebook does this, for example, and you can do it too because they've made their bias training available for free online in video format. I did it. I think it's excellent. And they go through the various biases that we have when we hire people or when we assess the performance of someone. And their thinking is that if you learn to recognize all the different kinds of biases and you check yourself all the time, then you will rely on your biases less. That's pretty hard. There's 183 of these puppies, and those are just the general ones, right? So there's another technique that works for bias, and that's mindfulness, which, as you know, I teach. And mindfulness is the art of decreasing your automatic responses and increasing your conscious choices. So instead of formulating quick opinions, you think about things a little slower. That's what mindfulness teaches. But because I was so upset about this problem, it didn't seem very viable that I could call all the newsrooms in the world and be like, hey, you have a problem, let me come and teach you how to fix it. That wasn't really going to scale. So instead of doing that, I created NewsMavens with the general financial support of Gazeta Wyborcza and Google Digital News Initiative Fund. And what we decided to do is we decided to show the world that there is a difference, that what women choose is actually a different kind of news. And we put together a newsroom, which is now about 30 women. There's 3 in Warsaw, we're the core, and then we have women from every single European region. And their task is to select the news story that they would have put on the front page if they were in charge. So they're not writing new news stories, they are curating news. And what we're trying to do is create an alternative front page for Europe to show you what women think is most important. Not the only important, but the most important. We set out to answer the question, what happens when only women choose the news? And it's been a year since we launched. And people keep asking me, so what does happen? Come on, tell us. So I'll tell you. We did some analysis after the year, and for our birthday, we released an article that details what we noticed happens. But before I go into it, first of all, I'm not going to narrate this entirely in my own voice because NewsMavens is this collaboration between women from all sorts of countries. And we asked them what they think is unique about NewsMavens, and they sent us quotes. So I'm going to be showing you quotes and explaining some context. This is Cinzia from Italy. And she says that the NewsMavens story selection is different because the articles are not commissioned by the editor-in-chief, and therefore what is published mirrors the journalist's personal and professional interests. Which begs the question, what does Zuza do all day? I don't select their stories. I edit them. And I consider my task keeping the team happy and keeping the project growing and making sure that it's sustainable. But what she says is that this is a marked difference. Lidia Pisker, who covers the Balkans for us, told this story. She said this February, a Bosnian female journalist made public the sexual comments she received from a male writer and businessman. It was thought to be the beginning of Bosnian Me Too, but most media ignored it. NewsMavens broke the ice, which was also the case in numerous other situations when women in the Balkans were under attack. And this was one of the main things that is perhaps obvious, but I think its meaning needs to be spelled out, is that women pay attention to women and other marginalized groups. We saw this in the case of a story from, where was it? I think Austria. From Austria, where it turns out that 15,000 women had been forced into unpaid labor in the 1970s by a Catholic Sisters of the Good Shepherd order. They were not paid, they were not given health care, and they were told not to say anything to anyone. They started coming forward. This was the 1970s. They started coming forward last year and asking to be compensated. The church said, we're not going to compensate you, but we can say we're sorry. So nobody covered this. NewsMavens did. There was also the case of an MP who got sued after going public about the sexual harassment she was experiencing. The man who was harassing her was more powerful, therefore he sued her, and he won. These are stories of how the system is failing women in Europe. Claudia Ciobanu, she covers Central and Eastern Europe. She also writes about Romania. Says that NewsMavens gives me the sense that if the world were run by women, we'd be all right after all. Not sure if I could get behind that statement fully, but it's nice to hear it articulated. She says that NewsMavens has such a huge focus on issues around social care, social justice, racism, and inequality, unlike anything I've seen in any national or international media. The big boys of journalism don't always have the attention span for that. And I think there's a lot of truth to this observation. In fact, we did a drawing that would show approximately what we think is happening. There's a tendency for mainstream media to really highly value looking at the top of the power structure. Okay, these are the politicians, the big business, and the big economy, big boys, who are making decisions about the future and the present of our world. And most editors have a really keen focus on figuring out what those guys are doing. And rightfully so. They have the biggest impact on our world. However, what women have showed via NewsMavens is that as a collective, we have a consistent tendency to focus on the effects of those decisions. So what happens lower down the pyramid as a result of those decisions made on top? And the conclusion of this, as far as I'm reading it, is that men pay attention to cause, women have a greater tendency to pay attention to effect. And if we want to tell stories in our newspapers fully, we need to be paying attention to both. I think this is a very strong argument about diversity in the newsroom. But going back to your favorite picture, your favorite slide, I think that this is also a greater issue. It's not only about elevating women, whether in newsrooms or anywhere else. This is an argument about diversity not being a moral judgment, a moral decision. It's not just based on liberal values that we think there should be more diversity at the top of the power structures in newspapers and in society. It's not about things being fair. It's about being able to see more of the truth. If you put more people with different kinds of brains, coming from different backgrounds that have shaped their perceptions differently, the more of these differences you put together, the greater your chance of seeing the big picture clearly. So what I'm saying is that diversity is this amazing opportunity for journalists, for them to stop being the know-it-alls who are telling everybody what to think, and to start being curious about discovering the truth about the big picture together.